Today's discussion will be presented in 3 sections. Since we are recording this session for a radio broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM, feel free to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll try to get them answered online. We're particularly pleased to welcome our moderator, Jason Miller, the executive editor of Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Let me turn over the reins to Jason to begin today's discussion.
Welcome to the program today. We're talking about big data and strategies to manage the explosion of information that's raining upon federal agencies. My guests today are Janice Glover-Jones, the Chief Information Officer of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Dr. John Pellegrino, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Strategic Integration, Gary Wyckoff, the Chief Information Officer in the Office of Naval Research, and Jody Houck, the Executive Director of U.S. DoD and U.S. Intelligence Business Sector for Veritas. Welcome to the program today.
Thank you.
Before we get started, let me set a little context for our discussion. In May, David Mader, the Office of Management and Budget's controller, quantified the amount of data the government produces as huge. It's probably a bit of an understatement. In fact, there are no good estimates for how much data huge really is. For instance, on data.gov, the portal has about 192,000 data sets. But with the growth of connected systems, commonly known as the Internet of Things, as well as better sensors, more devices, the amount of data agencies, and particularly the Defense Department, has to manage will only continue to grow. This means agencies must develop a data governance strategy and processes to go with it. The Federal Trade Commission, for example, reports that data has a life cycle, and it's divided into 4 phases: collection, compilation and consolidation, data mining and analytics, and of course, use. In each of those phases, agencies need to consider specific steps to ensure the data is usable, secure, and not overwhelming their decision makers. There are several ongoing data governance initiatives across government. Most recently, the Office of Management and Budget updated its data center consolidation initiative with a new draft policy. Among the things that it highlights in that policy are CIOs have a priority order when they decide they need more storage or bigger infrastructure. For instance, OMB wants CIOs to look at the cloud first, shared services for internal to the government second, and an agency-owned data center that only third, and it must already have been optimized. But it's more than data centers when we talk about data governance. It's tools that make the data useful, and it's the accessibility to ensure decision makers have access from anywhere at any time. IDC, the market intelligence firm, detailed a big data maturity model highlighting 5 phases. Those are ad hoc, opportunistic, which is a department-level siloed strategy, repeatable, which takes the strategy down to the business unit, managed, which takes a strategy across business units, and finally, optimize, which is an enterprise-wide strategy where processes and tools are being used at their greatest capabilities. Most agencies are still in the early stages of managing and using their data. They're still sorting out everything from cybersecurity to compliance to ensuring their information isn't stale and remains usable. And that gives us a lot to talk about today. So once again, our guests today: Janice Glover-Jones, the Chief Information Officer of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Dr. John Pellegrino, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Strategic Integration, Gary Wyckoff, the Chief Information Officer in the Office of Naval Research, and Jody Houck, the Executive Director of U.S. DoD and U.S. Intelligence Business Sector for Veritas. So let's get started. When we're talking about impact, data deluge, we're talking about just the amount of data that agencies have. How to manage that? How is your agency dealing with that? So let me start with Janice. You're right here to my left. Give me a sense of how DIA is dealing with the data deluge.
So you're absolutely correct. What we're seeing today is an unprecedented amount of data coming in due to the exponential growth of data being created worldwide. Everything is now connected to the internet, including refrigerators, including devices like hearing aids. And so people and things are creating data at a rate that is generally unmanageable. And with our current culture and policies and technologies, many of these data sources, to include social media and geospatial data, is now the Internet of Things for us. And so we're taking a strong look at that and working with our security partners and our Office of Counterintelligence. How do we update our policies to be able to deal with the influx of data? So as you said, we're in the early stages of it. I don't have the exact answer right now, but it's something that we are looking at and knowing that it is the inevitable, that we have to deal with it, especially around security.
If you only had the answer, then we could be done here.
You got that right.
But I'm not sure anyone has the answer. I think that's part of the challenge. When you say you're updating your policies, is that from a DIA only perspective or across the entire intelligence community?
So it's across the, we live in the intelligence community, so we will follow what the OD&I lays out, and then we would have to update some of our internal policies. And we're looking where we can partner with that. Like, for example, I'm looking at where I can leverage what some of NSA has already done, especially around healthcare devices, pacemakers, and things of that nature.
Let me turn to John. You bring from a different perspective. You're obviously wear two hats, right? You have the strategic integration, but also the CIO at the Army Research Lab. So again, you're dealing with a lot of data as well. Talk about your attack vector, if you will, on data.
Absolutely, and that attack vector really has to depend on the type of data we're talking about. So let me very broadly characterize, if I may, into three general areas. First, you've got the business operations intelligence kinds of data, which is very important, and we're beginning to use more and more in all sorts of decisions, from research directions to what's happening in the international community, and trying to understand that and put that kind of data together. Secondly, we've got research data that stems from things like how do networks operate, doing the modeling of different kinds of networks, the integration of networks with coalition networks, and different kinds of data that come across there, which leads me to the third type, and that is the battlefield data, which overlaps here with the intelligence community and decision-making down on the battlefield. For the research type of data, just to use one example, the data is increasing at approximately, an order of magnitude every 2 to 3 years. So that means we have to look at our structures, how we manage it, how we keep it, and the additional, icing on the cake with that is, the nice part, the information processing algorithms, approaches, et cetera, are all maturing at a very rapid rate. There are new things to do, to worry about, coupled with the cybersecurity issue. So we have an opportunity there. So we have to keep restructuring our architectures every several years. So not only does some of this hardware go out of service every few years, it needs updating, but the general approach and architecture overall has to be updated. And of course, the sources we're talking about now range everything from the video and audio and text analytics all the way to the sociocultural interactions and interactions of different kinds of networks. So it's a big challenge.
When you talk about not just the hardware, that we can understand. When we talk about, hey, more storage in the cloud, more data analytic processing tools. But when we talk about the processes also need to change, how do you get ahead of that? I mean, and maybe that's a longer discussion that we all can get into, but give us at least your initial take.
Well, initial take is we have to stop considering isolated portions of the network as just one piece, and that we have to consider that we're dealing with an interplay of network types, of both the information network, the physical and communications network, and the sociocultural network, and how all of those interact. And they don't evolve singly, they evolve together. So that's how we have to look at it, and if we had that answer, we'd be golden.
You and Janice could leave. Let me turn to Gary Wyckoff, Office of Naval Research. You have a very similar problem as Dr. Pellegrino, I imagine. Same situation with the multiple data coming from multiple areas. Talk about how ONR is dealing with this data deluge.
Well, we're dealing it by buying more storage to start with. In the 5+ years I've been there, we've gone from 60 terabytes to 120 terabytes of storage. So it's growing, but the sources, as John alluded to, are growing. We're getting video now, high definition video, where before we might have gotten a little bit of video. Now video is becoming the big thing to transpire or to transfer over with information in it, because you see things real time almost, and you can witness this. So from the ONR standpoint, we may be doing tests in the field, and before you got some analytical data back, and you could look through the structured data to see what the results were. Now you can get a video of that and actually see what happened and change the interpretation of the reports. Our problem then becomes, what do we do with all of that data? And it becomes a blob for us. And we're working on how do we sort through it and keep what's important, for regulatory purposes, and the other pieces for analytic purposes. What is it we need to keep? What can we get away with or get rid of? And that's where we really struggle, is how much of our data is just noise, if you will, and what's the authoritative data that we really want to retain. And that's where we seem to struggle quite a bit. And I don't think we can bring in all the tools we want, but I think we have to start to change the culture, which is don't keep everything, keep what's important. And that's where we struggle with right now.
Now, Jody, I know wants to jump in because data hoarding is a topic we're going to talk about later, I know. But before we do, real quick, Gary, when you talk about the struggle you're talking about with what's authoritative, what's not, what do you keep, what don't you keep, give me a sense, is that a policy issue? You said it's a culture issue as well. Or is that, how do you overcome that? Because people love information. Information is power.
Correct. So from our standpoint, it's more a cultural issue, I would say. Our performers and our scientists want to keep everything, and to the point where if they give a briefing to one command, they want to keep that briefing. They could give the same briefing to another command, they want to keep that briefing too, and it just begins to multiply itself out. Or if I want to share a video with you, I give it to you, and you, rather than point to where it's stored, share it out, and it replicates itself across the network. So we're trying to work with using hot links, but working with NMCI, we have some issues with that because of security issues that come along with some hot links. So we're trying to be smarter and change the culture about how we do things. Internally, we can use links to point back to data storage and say, hey, go on our R drive, look in this folder, here's a file, look at that. Don't send it and put it in your folder too. But that's part of it. We need to deduplicate, and we try to do that to the large extent possible. But you'll go out and you'll see 7 versions of the same thing in somebody else's file, and that's our struggle.
But it's so much easier just to send the link than to go to that folder, download it, or whatever it is. It comes down to people.
It's culture.
It's culture.
Lazy. We used to be able to send hot links. You could click and go. Now, because of security, you can't click. You have to cut and paste. And so somebody said, well, just easy to put an attachment on a file, send it, click the attachment, and I see the video.
Jody, I know you're listening, you're jumping up and down, you have a lot of excitement because of what obviously Veritas does, but beyond that, are you hearing very similar things from your clients? Give me your take on what you heard.
So interestingly enough, last week I was out at PACOM in Hawaii at Camp Smith, and on Tuesday I was with the Air Force, and both organizations are struggling with how to manage information. And notice I said information, not data, because we've done a study recently, the Data Genomics Project, and we identified across 89% of the Fortune 500 companies that somewhere between 30 and 60% of the data those organizations contain is technically rot, redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And if you could look at what Gartner has specified, it cost $5 million to manage and retain a petabyte of data. If that data isn't content rich and doesn't help you drive a mission solution, you're going to spend time combing through all that rot before you actually get to the decisions you're looking for. And in some cases in research and development, you might need to contain more information because the insights come later at an aha moment. But typically in organizations, how many emails do we want to save that are from Jody to my coworkers that I'm getting ready to leave for lunch? It's not relevant, it doesn't give you decision advantage, and it certainly clogs up a lot of your environment. Those are what we call basically write once, read never files in your PST folders. So what we're looking at is new ways of understanding what your data is, and there's a cybersecurity implementation here, right? You want to know what you have, you want to know where it is, you want to know who's accessing it, and when they accessed it last. So as part of the Data Genomics Project, we identified that 41% of the data in these 89% of the Fortune 500 companies had not been touched in 3 years. That's what I would call stale and non-analytical data. And of that, 12% hadn't been touched in 7 years. So maybe how we start this journey is we start by first understanding what's in our data holdings, decide what is information through some sort of process, procedure, policy, and at the very beginning, identify what our rot is and get rid of it, because that rot is that unstructured data. And if we don't do so, the Air Force told me on Tuesday that they fear they're going to spend 70% of their time searching through what they consider as meaningless data. That leaves 30% for mission. That's very scary to a mom who has a son in the Army that relies on real-time battle rhythm information when he's flying his helicopter. And the Air Force said their second largest expense besides fuel is storage. So we can't continue to grow at 30, 40% a year over year, this data deluge, without doing something that makes sense out of it, or we're going to kick the can down the road to our kids and our grandkids.
I love the term rot. I don't think I've ever heard that before in all my years covering this community and talking about data. When you talk to agencies and they go, yeah, but, do you get that sense that there's always a but when it comes on the other end of, yeah, that's rot. Yeah, but I may need it someday. I mean, we always kept paper, right? I'm a hoarder of paper as bad as anyone.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, my background is largely the intelligence community. I spent many years designing really unique capabilities before technology caught up, and it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun making technology do what it couldn't do. That said, we hear, I've got a 25-year retention policy. Okay, but do you have to keep that 25 years worth of data all in your most expensive architecture? And do you want to have to crawl through all 25 years of that data that you've determined has no mission value any longer? Intelligence data is really important. We build big sensors and big collectors to grab it, but it has a temporal aspect to it in many cases. Once you've looked at something and analyzed something, what happened yesterday is no longer relevant to what's happening today. And so we've got to do a better job right now, and we've got to have, I'll just say, the leadership and the courage to begin looking at this problem differently. And that's what we're trying to bring to our partners.
Let me go back to the government side of the panel for a second. Several of you were nodding your heads and kind of and smiling as you heard Jody talk. Let me start with you, John. Your perspective of the rot issue, of the storing it, and how you store it and where you store it. Is that something you guys are looking at as well?
Well, absolutely. But let me go another layer deeper and say that this is a wonderful opportunity for the research community, because if you look at the technical community, the engineers that design the systems, et cetera, they're designing it from a standpoint of an architecture, an information technology architecture. Well done, great stuff, but they're not necessarily designing it from the human use perspective. So what are the ways that which we can access the information, discern what needs to be saved and what doesn't, and lets you analyze the rather obvious at the moment that if Janice and I have a wonderful email exchange, all of a sudden we've got 2 copies of that exchange now floating around out in space there, out in digital space. So is that really the best way to do it, especially since we're both using a cloud architecture to store, and then we multiply that conversation by all of us? That's just a simple example where we could have multiple copies of the same thing. Needlessly. All
right. Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we can kind of pull the string on that a little bit. You're listening to the panel discussion, Trends in Data-Driven Decision-Making in Government, sponsored by Veritas on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.